Okie doke, so welcome back to environmental interpretation. We have been working on games, as you know, and the assignment for today was to kind of take a look at that game design brief document, which is the shortened template out of a much longer file that is used by professional game designers. This particular file that you and I are working on right now this semester was originally developed by a guy named James Hostetler, who works in the game design industry. And this is kind of like the prototype form of the so-called design Bible of any particular game. So if you think back to any of like the major blockbuster AAA, super fancy, very popular games that are put forward by huge game studios like Microsoft, Bungie, there's a bunch of them now, and published by companies like Electronic Arts and stuff like that. You know, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. The spend on games is now on average multiple times the average spend on a movie, which tells you something, because we have this sort of cultural idea of, you know, the glamorous Hollywood star lifestyle. Well, games are now getting quite a bit more investment than movies are, and making a lot more profit as well. We were talking on Monday about games like Pokemon Go, right? So it did not cost Niantic over $1 billion to develop that game, but man, a whole lot of people sure like playing it. And you tend to play games a whole lot more than you watch a particular movie. Make sense? So it's smarter money from a business perspective, and it's also a heck of a lot more money overall from that side of things. So all that to say, this game design brief is, you can imagine this not just like 2, 3, 4 pages long and kind of 1 or 2 sentence answers like we're using it for. You could have entire chapters for each sub-question implied by each of the questions that we have. And so you'll get 2, 3, 4, 500 page long documents with all sorts of concept art, with thoughts by not just you, the individual game designer, but the entire team of game designers, and people who are working to do things like cultural localization. So for example, in game settings like Pokemon, you have a whole bunch of essentially very clever Japanese wordplay things baked into the name and the evolved names of each of the Pokemon. So like Pikachu, for example, that name translates to like spark sizzle in Japanese, or like sizzle lightning, something like that. And some of that wordplay can get lost in translation. So you have, for a global brand like the Pokemon Company has, you know, dozens or hundreds of people working on localizing and recontextualizing each of those jokes or wordplay, sort of little references or nods to cultural stuff or whatever, across all of the different many languages that they go through. So if any of you guys ever watched the Harry Potter movies, or before that read the Harry Potter books, right? The first book is called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone here in the United States. But even from English to English, British English to American English, that title had to be recontextualized as the Sorcerer's Stone instead of the Philosopher's Stone, which is a much more recognizable sort of children's myth and legend thing of alchemy in Europe and in the UK. Versus here, that doesn't mean anything for us, so they retitled the whole thing. That's a pretty big deal. So stuff like that matters, and it takes big teams of people to do that, because it's a lot of brain power to try and figure all that stuff out. So all that to say, we're using a super duper chopped down version of it, and we want to kind of circle back on those. And if you have yours printed out, go ahead and pull that out. We'll go through those today. And we have on the front page of our course website a little Dropbox with a link to the game design document as well. Up on the announcement sections, the first or second announcement on there. So if you haven't had a chance to spot that yet, go ahead and do that. Okay. So I wanted to take a moment to, with Jacob's permission, go through his, because he really sort of got the point of this assignment and it worked really pretty well. So I thought we might sort of call some positive attention to that and see what we might do to kind of extract that same value that Jacob did with everybody else's. In particular, wanted the response that he had in kind of spurring a very specific line of thought to make you and me more effective and efficient in setting up these games for your particular chosen interpretive themes for this semester. So if you are looking at yours, we want to go down to the second question block that says, what does your game aim to do? And this is just kind of zoomed way out on the screen there. Sorry if it's hard to read. So the answer to the question, what is the purpose of your game, right? Because we're using these games as a tool, not as just a way to fill time or entertain people. We want to make sure that our answer to this lines up with what are we interpreting? Why did we choose this as an interpretive topic in the first place? Why are we working so hard on that theme, that one sentence, encapsulation of the heart and soul of it, and so forth? And Jacob wrote, I would say the purpose of my game is to replicate the experience of climbing in a very scaled down form. It is supposed to teach the lesson of trying again and iterating that you see in climbing when projecting a route, or projecting a route, right? So we call routes projects. Breaking it down, analyzing, okay, this particular pitch or route or path among holds didn't work so well. I hit a spot that I just couldn't get past, so let me take a step back, look at the wall, and see if I can find an alternate way up or a different combination of holds to get me there, or past the crux or difficult spot. A lot of climbing is about repetition and trying out new approaches. Rarely, and here's the key, rarely do people send routes at their skill level on the first try. So send is climber jargon for successfully complete, or related ideas. So this is the lesson that Jacob is using or embedding inside that little labyrinth-like game, yeah? And it's immediately apparent that this is probably not gonna work on your first try. I think your guess on how long it takes to play the game, like the first time, was on the order of seconds, right? Yeah, it's a pick up and play game that will likely last no longer than 30 seconds per round, right? So quick feedback on strategy, one of those big design hallmarks we were talking about last week. So when I see stuff like, rarely do people send routes at their skill level on the first try, that's a teachable moment, right? That's an opportunity to not just sort of bake that into the DNA of the game, bake that into the mechanics of the game so people experience that lesson in a safe and fun way. But it's also, and here's the most important part, this is a clear green flag to say, hey, go hard on this direction. This is where everything else has to be built around. And specifically, this is the kind of question that you ask in the debrief at the end. So the debrief, in sort of schematic form, is just connecting back with folks, pulling us out of the game mindset, the game is now over, and asking things like, what just happened? Or what did you experience in this game? Or what did you think about this game? Or what did you learn from this? Okay. And you're thinking, in Jacob's case, maybe somebody might say, man, this was a total disaster the first time. Like, I didn't even get the marble started before it fell off. I was moving to the starting point and I had to reset. So my first try was like -2 seconds, right? But we're looking for, when people are answering those debrief questions, because we always want to do a debrief. We're never just playing a game for the sake of playing, right? We always want to extract the wisdom, the value, the learning, the sort of experiential change, growth, development as a function of the game, and make it explicit. Have a chat about it. Never just assume that people are experiencing and taking away from this game experience what you think they are. Right? Have any of you guys ever played a game where, like, you could kind of see where the game designer was trying to go with it, and it was just poorly executed, or some particular part of the game was a little bit bloated or heavy, and it's just like, yeah, I see where you're going with it, but I'm spending all my time like moving little tokens and not actually playing the game, right? Games like Gloomhaven, it takes an hour to set that board game up every time you play a 1 to 4 hour session, and it takes another 45 minutes to tear it down, right? That's almost 2 hours of not playing the game to play the game. So we want to make sure that the design that we're putting out there is getting folks, generally, not every time, right? We're not a bunch of clones, not all moving lockstep through these experiences, but generally speaking, are you successfully hearing from folks what you thought you might? And if not, that's not necessarily a problem. It is at least interesting. Okay? So, if people are saying, man, I was doing this, and really the main thing that I learned is that I just have really shaky hands. Okay? That's not what the game is about, right? So that might be a limitation of some players to design around, to make the game more accessible. In the same way that if we have folks who are mobility limited with crutches, if you sprain your ankle, or if you are wheelchair bound or something like that, you can smooth out a trail, you can grade a trail, make it less steep, and make it accessible for those folks. We can modify games in exactly the same kinds of ways using similar mindsets and techniques to make the game more playable for folks through no fault of their own who just have shaky hands, okay? And in that way, we sort of take the focus, take the lived experience of playing the game from, man, I have really shaky hands, and that kind of made the game less successful and less fun for me, to, oh, I'm playing this cool game, and it doesn't matter if my hands shake too much because maybe there's some mechanical linkage that smooths things out, or you're using a joystick that moves a motor-controlled thing through instead, right? Lots of different ways to solve that problem. You could use a larger diameter straw to balance that marble atop of, which holds the marble better because it's more sunk down into the cavity of that cylinder. Lots of different ways you could modify it, okay? So, with our outlines, those 5-part outlines and stuff like that, and we have one thematic point, or possibly more, that is encapsulated by the game. Within that thematic point, the tail end of it, the bottommost point, right before the transition out to the next thematic point or the conclusion, is debrief. And we want to ask anything out of those questions of, so what just happened? What did you learn? What did you think about this experience? How did this go? Right? Very open-ended questions, because I'm not trying to quiz people, we're trying to understand and connect. Make sense? All right, so with that long sort of introduction to this game design doc debrief, how did this assignment go for you? Did it help you kind of think through anything? Show of hands. For how many of you was it a straight through exercise? You sat down, answered the questions, and moved on to the next thing in your day? Because the game design brief pretty well already aligned with your game design plans, sort of your one-pager description of what the game is, rules, mechanics, tokens, roles, all that stuff. Show of hands, pretty straightforward, straight through on to the next thing. Okay, everybody in the class. Sometimes this sparks a sense of, okay, so I think this is what my game is about. I think my players will come to understand that this is what the game is about. I need to make sure that I'm checking in with that. I'm collecting feedback. This is kind of each debrief is like a super mini embedded program evaluation. How did just this little experience go? Is it tracking with what I think, or folks will surprise you sometimes? And again, a surprise isn't always a negative thing. If folks are experiencing it differently than you are, they can teach you something about it that maybe you haven't experienced or thought about before. So, with a rock climbing simulation type game, for somebody who's never been rock climbing before, they're going to understand the metaphor of the game, the central metaphor, pretty differently than somebody who's an avid rock climber and designing a game about or simulating rock climbing. Yeah? They might pick up on the symbology. What are the shapes and colors and representative symbols on that board or that track or that path? that you're gonna move that marble through. Maybe they keyed in on that in a way that you didn't really think about. Maybe those symbols mean something slightly different to that person than to you. So as one example of collecting this debrief information from folks as part of the content of the experience, and partly as program evaluation, would be listening for comments about even things as subtle as, what colors did you choose? So, here in the United States, when you see like a green circle by a red octagon, what does that green circle typically represent? Symbolically. Go, yeah, or continue, or move forward, or we also tend to, in Western societies, tend to associate the color green with life, right? Living green things. In other cultures, that's completely backwards, right? In Southeast Asian cultures, the color red, as symbolic of blood, represents life. But to us, red, especially in an octagon shape, means what? Stop, or danger, or death, or wait here for some other game trigger or event to happen, right? So, we want to ask these questions, and hopefully most folks are sort of near the center of mass of where you think they are, right? But every once in a while you're listening for, man, I can't figure out why there was that sequence of colors. Like each of those kind of spots along that track of that rock climbing path it was the same sequence of 5 or 6 primary and secondary colors, and it kept repeating that order, but I didn't get why, you know? So that's a good cue to, if you have something like that, make that sequence of colors meaningful somehow, right? So maybe around sharp turns, maybe you have that colored red or black, or if it was a skiing type game, you'd have double black diamond symbols around that real tight curve that a lot of people knock the marble off at, or whatever, okay? So, all I have to say, if your game doesn't have meaning for any visual elements, or if it doesn't have meaning attached to any of the or one of the tokens or something like that, either find a way to pull that token out or give it meaningful representation. So the color red means something. The color yellow or orange typically means something as well, right? So with the color symbology of the National Highway Traffic Safety Association, NHSTA, right? So yellow is information and warning. Red is danger and stop and don't go this way. And green is just informational. Brown is informational, but in a slightly different way than the navigation of green signs. It's more like sight information signs along the way of the route. And orange along a highway or interstate signifies what? Lets you know that what's coming up. Construction, exactly. Road hazards. You don't want to splatter some highway construction person into a thin red mist, you know? So let's let everybody know that there are people at work along the roadway. And in a construction context, we don't want to drive off and bust an axle where they've pulled out some of the road's concrete. Something like that, okay? So use colors in that way, in ways that your most typical audience fully expect. In Japan, for example, the informational signs that we would see as brown background, white text, or black text on a white background, typically have a bright blue background because blue is a higher frequency color and reflected light. And blue can travel pretty far and be sort of highly visually, we have high visual acuity around bright blues. So we can see that, and it's a way for that particular culture to signify, hey, you need to pay attention to what's on this sign. But if we see a blue sign, it doesn't mean anything to us, right? But we also don't have a ton of Japanese people sort of running around in our parks, that I know of. They could be very stealthy, I don't know. But we want to make sure that everything in the game has some sort of meaning. Everything, right? Every square inch of the board. If it is a rock climbing route. Make most of the board look like a rocky surface, right? Even to the point of texturing it and painting it if you want to sink some extra resources into it. It can be more of a conceptual symbolism, like colors for go, warning, or wait, or stop, like at a stoplight, or what have you. And spur all of those off of the comments that folks are making, all those design updates, off of the comments and feedback with your low-key program evaluation and the debrief at the end of each game. Sound good? Okay, so for each of you, head to question 2 here. What was your answer to the first question of area 2 here? What is the purpose of your game? And let's take a second look at that idea. So, is every element of the game that you're presenting to folks, is it representative and functional in some way in communicating some aspect of that purpose of the game? So, take a look at yours, take a second to reflect, and we'll chat about it. As you're thinking about it, where the game is highly symbolic, like a memory matching game, flipping over cards. You've got some information on one side of the card. What about the back side of the card? Could that be made more useful real estate somehow than just being a blank card back? Does that make sense? So, we're taking a look at the tokens, the roles, the behaviors, the mechanics, whatever that your game leans into with the human not game. Does the game represent anything? Is it a metaphor for anything else, or is it purely a team building exercise to help sort of warm people up to each other, break the ice, and help sort of establish or create an appropriate and healthy group dynamic, right? So, the human not game has been used in the past to depict things like protein folding, which has nothing to do with team building. But proteins are these long, ropey, sort of floppy molecules. And so for somebody who is interpreting molecular biology as a topic area, talking about how do medicines work, right? How do different bacteria and viruses and so forth, how do they attack human cells at the gene level for certain kinds of viruses in particular? And what happens, right? It unfolds the DNA, forces that cell nucleus to output some other genetic payload, and then refolds it back up and the cell keeps on going, or it goes into overdrive so hard that the cell eventually just kind of ruptures and explodes with all that sort of trash viral DNA piling up in there, okay? It's the same game as we played about team development, but there's a symbolic layer that the game is trying to help us understand and access in a way that any normal human can do, right? We can understand things like protein folding by folding ourselves together in some sort of big clump or Gordian knot and trying to untie ourselves. Cool. All right? So, not to say you don't have to talk about protein folding, right? That has nothing to do with what you're interested in. So, don't try to shoehorn something like that in. But ask this question, you know, what is my game about? And is everything, even the backs of my memory matching cards, am I using that space in some way to talk about some other part of it? Is every word that I'm saying as I am helping people set up this human knot, is that reinforcing? Or am I adding extra words that just kind of are filling airspace because I'm uncomfortable with silence? Okay? So, anybody? What do you think? Is there any spot in obviously those are draft 0 or draft 1 prototypes, but is there anything on your game that you could kind of see a blank spot and think, man, that's untapped potential. I could put something else in there. Not for the sake of filling everything up, but reinforcing that central metaphor. Anybody got any ideas on that line? Yeah.
Or like my guess who game, like on the side that the player's looking at, it just has like the names of the tools, so just like put the picture there as well. So
Yeah.
they have a visual representation when they're asking questions, so they can base it off of the picture as well as what
Cool.
they know about the use.
Yeah. And eventually this would take some work, maybe some resources, but you can imagine like a really good, well-composed photo or illustration of that specific instrument in its context of different kinds of blues groups or solo performers, something like that. Yeah? Cool. So in that way, like every inch of that available space, every square inch, is helping to reinforce what it is. Like maybe somebody can't from a distance spot the difference between 6-string electric guitar and the electric bass next to it. But you outline and sort of highlight the bass, if that's what that particular card is for, and sort of gray out the 6-string guitar so folks understand, okay, this is one of these 2-stringed instruments, but it's not just a 6-string guitar, which would be a very, very easy mistake to make for anybody who's not super familiar with or had to think about a whole bunch of different, blues or jazz instruments before. Make sense? Cool. So we want to ask ourselves, how can we be maximally efficient with all of the space and time and stuff that we have available to us in this game? And if it's highly thematic, everything is reinforcing what you're using the game to get at. What's the point of the game? Cool? Cool. All right, let's change gears a little bit. Did anybody sort of have any questions about any of these game design doc questions? It asks or talks about some of these things from a slightly different perspective than we do in class up to this point, but did it mostly make sense to everybody? Pretty straightforward? Okay, cool. Right on. All right. Did anybody with the what tools is this going to need come up with sort of a depressingly long list? Or to really do this game right, I should learn Microsoft Publisher or InDesign, something like that, some super expensive program? Hopefully not. There's nothing wrong with that stuff. And you're a powerful and flexible and contributory organism in the game design process when you start picking up those skills. But for this class, you're not on the hook for those things. So, cardboard for the prototypes, plenty good enough, as long as we can see where you're going with it. Okay, good deal. All right, let's move on. Any other questions, comments, observations about the game design doc? Awesome. Is there anything you wish wasn't here from the larger chopped out professional version that you were just dying to impress us with that didn't make it on there? All right, I rarely get a positive answer on that one, but just want to ask in case you guys want to start your stuff. Good deal. All right, moving forward from there. So, our game design brief is a pretty good entree into our next topic, which is taking that sense of using games as essentially a form of communication, right, and facilitation, and widening that sense of this game is a metaphor. It's not just a game, it's a game about something. And that something is the sort of the target of the metaphor. Now, a metaphor is itself a particular kind of communication. It's called figurative language. So we're going to spend today working on exploring different kinds of figurative language, because games are one such example of one such type of figurative language. And there's a lot of these. You're going to recognize a bunch of these from like 6th, 7th, 8th grade English class, unless the American public education system has failed you. But if you don't recognize any of these, that's cool. We're going through them, okay? Let's take a kind of an early break today for a couple minutes. If you need to stretch your legs, get some water, while I pull up the figurative language PowerPoint, and we'll get into it. We'll see why these games are the way that they are. Okay. Cool. So, we're almost back. Cool. We'll get into this at 2 levels and move through as fast as we can till the warm weather returns. The older I get, the more it hurts when it gets cold. You know, like it hurts my soul a little bit when it's like 35 and blowing today versus sunny and 75 on Sunday.
It's very rainy.
Say again?
Said it could be rainy.
That is true. That is true. Like I got an ice warning driving in this morning, segueing in this morning. It's very sad. But it's still February. I mean, to be fair. just by an informal straw poll while we're waiting. Has anybody ever heard of metonymy before? Synecdoche? Today's your day. Cool. This is a class session for word nerds, but I think we'll all pretty quickly see this is the difference between a halfway engaging speaker and somebody who is not so much. And we all do so many of these constantly. Start to recognize that we already know most of these by default. Just never really had a name for them. So you learn anything today. All right. So where we're going with this is there's this really long list of things that linguists have identified as non-literal communication. So if I say this tabletop is stone, that is straightforward, factual, literal communication. It's also not very exciting. Right? So our mantra from the beginning of the semester has been we're going to start with good, true, factual information and interpretation every time. We have access to awesome historical archives and researchers and so on and so forth as interpreters. We can know the topic of our interpretation really, really, really well. But we never stay there. That's our first step, knowing everything that is worth knowing about our topics to interpret. And all of the journey of interpretation is figuring out how to make that accessible to folks, figuring out how to make it engaging to folks, figuring out how to help people be comfortable and excited about talking about this particular topic, whatever it is, when they may not have been equipped ever to do that before. So that's cool. That's exciting. And all of this non-literal communication stuff is how we're going to move, or a big part of how we're going to move beyond just dry recitation of facts that nobody really cares about and doesn't typically survive very long in the wild because nobody cares. All right, so where we are going with this is on our course website. We have a really big list. This is lots of pages long, but it's a lot of white space. And we'll go through a bunch of these together, and I'll provide you a definition and maybe an example or two of each one to get a sense of it. And for those that we don't get through, take those home and head on to see if you can find a quick definition. Just Googling it online is usually enough. And then finding for yourself one or a couple of examples of that one to help you understand it and start to move to the point of being able to consciously choose. My interp could really do well, for example, with a framing narrative, sort of an outer story around the story that I'm trying to tell, to help people orient to that inner, maybe less familiar story, okay? Or this particular topic lends itself really, really, really well to efficient parallelism. And I can set up kind of a cadence or a rhythm in the things that I present, so one after the other in this interp, staffed or unstaffed, and help folks see kind of that repeated structure, and that will help reinforce the message in a useful and very compact and efficient way. Okay? So, the whole idea is not to become vocabulary masters, right? We don't care about that. We don't care about it, I don't care about it. We want to see which of these might be the right tools, figurative language tools, for your particular interp topics. So the selection out of this super long list is going to be a little bit different every time because every topic is a little bit different and it has unique needs relative to the people who are trying to, through you, connect with it. All right? So this is where this is going. And again, it's a long document, but it's a lot of white space. That's okay. You don't have to write a paragraph on any of these, just like a good phrase-long definition and one or two examples. Sound good? All right. This is a tool that is useful for you far beyond just environmental interpretation. This is a good life skills kind of a list. All right, so let's get into it. So, with our content or figurative language-based techniques, these are different ways to format the content. The facts don't change, right? The content doesn't change. How we convey it to folks, how we open it up and make it accessible and interesting and challenging to folks, inviting, exciting, whatever the vibe needs to be. This is what we use because this is what all humans have used for all of human communication for at least the last 17,000 years. At least, and probably well over 100,000 years before that, based on what evolutionary anthropologists can piece together about the development of the modern human brain and language capability. So, self-referencing is our first one, and it is a shadowing type of content-based technique or figurative language technique. So, self-referencing is when you have the person in their head think about themselves in relation to whatever you're talking about, or whatever they're reading on the page, or whatever they're staring at with the exhibit or sign or interactive. Okay? So, in a speech context, a very, very common way to trigger self-referencing, because we can't not do it on some sort of preconscious level. We can't not answer this question when it's posed. All right. So, just think of yourself, when was the last time you were camping? We all know an answer to that question. Pretty quick, right? You might have to think back, I'm trying to answer this at like down to the month level, down to elapsed minutes, hours, and seconds level, or just like ballpark, it was like 5 years ago. But we all have an answer to that question, even if it's, I've never been camping. So, self-referencing is at the top of this list because interpretation is all about helping people see and experience the connection between themselves and the thing that is being interpreted. And you as the interpreter are part of facilitating that connection. You are not the connection, you are participatory in it. Okay? Self-referencing is one of the most direct ways to help people see their connection to the thing. If I'm interpreting camping, I can ask, when was the last time you were camping? And now we're thinking about not just camping, but me in a camping context, or you in a camping context, whoever is hearing that question and thinking about it. Okay? So self-referencing, it's that simple and it's that powerful. So it's at the top of our list. We want to ask that question a lot, most times. Typically. It's a very, very widely deployable kind of thing. Labeling is a little bit like self-referencing, but it's less explicit. We talk about some hypothetical third part. So if I'm talking to you about peanut butter and good or bad parenting, and I make the genius branding statement, well, I'm talking about peanut butter, and see if you can finish the sentence. Choosy moms choose what? Anybody know that brand? Jif. Yeah. That marketing campaign is like 15 years old at its newest. But choosy moms choose Jif. All right? Think back to, I don't know if Saturday morning cartoons are still a thing. They were a huge deal when I was a little kid. Maybe we're all just on YouTube 24/7 anyway now. But back when like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were on their original on-air run at like 10 a.m. on Fox on Saturday mornings, all of the commercials are aimed at kids, right? And so you see a bunch of labeling type things. So we're labeling moms who are choosy, they're good moms. They provide Jif. And we know that they're good moms because they're connected with Jif. And then there's the abusive, neglectful human trash of all the moms who don't choose Jif, right? Yeah. It's a subtle thing. They're not actually saying that, but they're setting up that dichotomy, that choice, that false dichotomy, right? There's a lot of space between moms who are awesome and moms who are not awesome, and some overlap on moms who are not awesome and choose Jif. But when you make an assertion, like a marketer does, this kind of person does or is XYZ. It forces the evaluation in your brain. You can't not think about it, but you're not thinking about it actively and consciously. Of, is that label applying to me or not? For me, it doesn't land. I'm not a mom. So it doesn't matter if I'm choosy, and it doesn't matter my peanut butter preference, right? Choosy moms choose Chip. And if you want to be a bad mom, then don't. It's fine. Choice is up to you, right? So, labeling is a very, very, very powerful thing. When you talk about groups of people using a singular label, like climbers, people are instantly, and strongly identifying, okay, do I check the boxes on whatever criteria I'm hearing that makes a climber? Or am I on the outside of that? We are contrast, we are decision, we are difference resolution engines in our brains. We can't not do it. Our brains cannot be comfortable with ambiguity. And if your brain is presented with visual ambiguity, for example, you literally hallucinate until your brain is like, oh, thank God, okay, I figured it out. This is how optical illusions work, right? Your brain literally supplies an interpretation of reality that is not true in order to remove ambiguity. We cannot be unsure about, am I in that label or am I out of it? Am I a good little boy or am I a terrible boy that's sent off to the orphanage, right? Like, we have to ask that question of ourselves anytime a label is presented by anybody, by a marketer, by an interpreter, by somebody you hope likes you, right? Maybe they're into something and so you're like, okay, well, I'm already doing this thing that this person likes, maybe that person might like me as a result of liking that thing, the so-called halo effect or spillover effect, right? So labeling is very powerful. You can set up hypothetical groups of people, right? And help folks sort themselves in or out. And the power of this is if somebody hears about some kind of a group that you're talking about or interpreting, and they think at first, that's not me, this doesn't affect me, this doesn't connect to me at all, I'm just gonna kind of hang back and listen. If you can help that person understand, hey, this is what you think right now, but by the end of this interpretation, let's see if your sense of that has changed. Okay? So that could take the shape of, for example, if you are talking about, I don't know, using reusable bags at the grocery store. And it's like, yeah, I'm aware that sometimes a low-density polyethylene grocery bag, gets blown by the wind and tumbleweeds its way down to the ocean, and then a sea turtle eats it, thinking it's food, and chokes to death or whatever. But that's like another species somewhere else. That might happen, but it doesn't affect me, right? There are lots of ways that we could help folks understand, hey, when that plastic tumbleweeds away, it's not just ending in some sea turtle's gullet 500 or 5,000 miles away at some coastline that's just trying to lay eggs or whatever. It's photodegrading the entire way. Every bounce is knocking off plastic, polyethylene oligomers, and you're breathing that. And it's crossing your blood-brain barrier, and it's lodging itself in your brain, and nobody's real sure what happens next. Right? So that helps folks understand, wait a minute, the label of people who are harmed by plastic bags, oh yeah, that does apply to me. It's not just an abstract concept that is touching somebody else or some non-human entity somewhere else some other time. this is real harm to me today, right? And it's subtle. But I cannot fix any harm that plastic bags are doing as they cross my blood barriers into various organ meats in my brain and stuff like that. There's just nothing I can do about it. So I hope it's not too bad, but that label does apply. And so that's an excuse to care about that and maybe do something about that, right? Live a lower plastic lifestyle. Maybe help advocate for social policies that reduce the burden of plastic bags getting everywhere and harming everybody just a little bit. We all die a little bit every plastic bag that's made, right? So that's a pretty big one. Self-referencing and labeling, they're at the top of our list for this reason. We're powerfully affected by our sense of I'm inside this group or I'm outside this group. And we can ask folks directly, when was the last time you, or have you ever thought about XYZ? Yeah, I self-reference, okay, this conversation is one I've had in my head many times. Or not, whatever. We sort ourselves in and out very powerfully on that, okay? That affects people pretty hard in a positive way, used right. Next, we have examples. And I'm not going to worry about defining examples because you know what examples are, right? Cool. So, if you have a pretty high concept thing, topic, phenomenon, principle that you want to interpret, like environmental stewardship, that's a super big thing. It's super loaded. It's bandied about back and forth in sort of like the politicized media and stuff like that, right? You say words like that and people either get sort of puckered or they get super interested or upset or depressed, right? It's a loaded thing. So that's too much. And we can overload people in that way by staying in that sort of high concept theoretical space. Let's bring it right down to earth with examples. Okay? UV photolysis of polyethylene molecules, high concept. Little bits of plastic floating in your brain, good example. Make sense? Cool. All right. An analogy is when you explain one thing in terms of some other explanation that's a little bit more recognizable or clear or friendly to the hearer, to the reader. So, if we're talking about protein fold, for whatever reason, let's say that's a super important, pressing topic for environmental interpretation, and like it's complex. That is literally quantum chemistry in how that works. We could just, by analogy, help folks understand big floppy, or tiny floppy protein molecules in the context of wrapping and unwrapping a human knot. So that's an analogy. It's explaining something that's difficult or complex or intimidating or scary or loaded in terms of something else. So analogy is very similar to a metaphor. Okay? An analogy is a explains B relationship. Metaphor is A is described in terms of B. So, chess is a metaphor for warfare. All of your games are a metaphor for something. And that something is the actual thing you're interpreting. So the metaphor is taking something that's difficult to see, hard to understand, intimidating, scary, weird, bland, boring, and explaining it, or identifying it, describing it, in terms of something else. Okay? Have you guys ride a motorcycle? Okay. Any of you guys ever been late to class? You don't have to raise your hand. But have you ever been like circling the lot and it's like 2 minutes to the top of the hour and somebody like pulls in front of you and gets like the last spot in that lot and you're like, fuck, as you're watching the clock and thinking, I'm just gonna be late today. but then you find a spot at the far end of the lot, and it's only like 1 after the top of the hour. You could still, like, the professor's kind of an idiot, and they are shuffling their papers the first couple minutes of class every time anyway. You could probably still, like, sneak in, sit in the back, it's a big lecture hall, and so you're flying down the hallway to get to that seat and just kind of get in there before the TA starts calling roll for the big class. You ever done that? Like, just flow down the hallway to... Well, you haven't. You're not flying. You're walking really fast. We're running. But we use the metaphor of flying because we tend to associate flying with moving quickly. Make sense? So you can tell a story and make it much more vibrant with lots and lots of metaphor. Dude, that festival was sick. Who said sick? Festival is not an organism. It cannot be infirm or experience disease pathology. But it's a way of describing in a more interesting way than the straightforward factual of the concert or music festival was well attended by many and diverse peoples who were enthusiastic about the musical acts. Nah, bruh, it was sick. Right? That's a metaphor. Okay? Cool. Similes are a particular kind of metaphor using the comparison mechanism of like or as. A does something like B, or A is as B. If your parents kind of deadbeat stay-at-home folks and they really liked watching soap operas like all day, every day in the 90s, before you guys were twinkling in anybody's eye, they might have watched soap operas like Days of Our Lives, which has been running for like 40 or 50 or 60 years now. It's crazy. And at one point when I was a kid, one of the characters was literally possessed by Satan. And they like pitch bended her voice down and gave her red contacts and stuff. Like, these shows are bananas. They're not actually bananas. That's a metaphor. Okay. But the tagline for that show is like sand through the hourglass, these are the days of our lives. So what is the simile of like sand through the hourglass? What does that mean?
Time is constantly flowing, I guess.
Time is constantly flowing. You can't stop it, and it's flowing one way, right? When that hourglass sand pours down, it's down. You can't go back and relive earlier parts of your life. And so it's this sense of, wow, okay, my life is more than just me getting up and checking my bursar bill and stressing about my silviculture test and trying to remember what I did last weekend. No, that's not any of you, but, right? It's saying, hey, life is precious. You have one shot at this, and each day that goes by, it's gone once it's gone. So, similes are very, very powerful because it's a straightforward, simple, clear metaphor. A metaphor can be as complex as a whole game, or as simple as like sand through the hourglass. It flows one way, here today, gone tomorrow, and then it's gone, gone. Okay? Cool. Poetry is full of similes and metaphors. In fact, it's very, very hard to find a song, especially a pop song, that has 0 metaphors in it, because metaphors are super compact. They're very, very efficient. You can pack a ton of meaning into flying down the hallway to class, right? It's not just the speed of motion, it is how that person looks as they're moving quickly. You can picture the expression on somebody's face as they're flying down the hallway trying to get to class before that roll call gets taken, stuff like that, right? It paints this whole picture with one word, flying. So, use similes and metaphors a lot. And you're already doing that naturally, I promise you. One of our exercises coming up will be to just pull the lyrics of one or a couple of your favorite songs and find how many of these figurative language techniques are in there. And sometimes we'll find 3, 4, 5 of them per line of lyric. how dense these can be. And it works because they're efficient, right? You can pack a lot of meaning, a lot of association or connotation into a single word of something like a metaphor, okay? So, self-referencing. Think of the last time that you blank. Labeling. Choose your moms, choose GIF. That's all state stance. Are you viewers? That's all state stance. Are you in good hands? Or, and this is the unsaid part, or are you fucked every time there's a big storm coming through? Carbondale is 98.5 on a scale of 100 for wind damage and risk. Did you know that? But don't worry. If you're in Allstate's hands, you're in good hands, right? Cool. Powerful stuff. Let's see. Examples using the discussed case as a proxy for what it is referring to, the larger thing. Analogies linking similar attributes of the unfamiliar with a familiar concept, explaining something unfamiliar with the familiar thing. Similes, borrowing one attributes of one concept, attaching them to another with similarities and differences. That's metaphors, similes, and analogies. Similes are specifically comparisons using like or as, and metaphor are using words associated with one thing to describe the thing you actually care about. Okay? The bike jets down the road. You fly down the hallway. Oh man, I am not attracted or infatuated to so-and-so. I am crushing so hard on so-and-so. It's a metaphor. Not actually, hopefully, not actually crushing that person. It's not literal communication. But it conveys more of a sense of, man, I think that person's bilateral symmetry and arrangement of adipose tissue is aesthetically pleasing, and I like the character of their integrity and so forth, right? Where you say, I'm just talking to this person, right? Or you can't stand a professor or a TA. What does standing have to do with it? Metaphor. All right. So love songs are full of metaphors, but because you can't talk about doing the dirty in public in the United States. Okay? So we also have a couple more kinds of comparisons. So metonymy is using an associated but not contained term to refer to something else. All right? This happens a lot in news reporting. A lot. So, when you hear on the newscast, not that anybody watches news these days, it's all, I don't know, news feeds, endless scrolling, state-sponsored misinformation campaigns, right? When you hear a statement like, the White House announced today, no it didn't, it's a building. Buildings don't speak, right? So, the White House is a shorter, more compact, but also more evocative term for the president, through their intermediary functionary called their press secretary, issued a public statement on the White House Rose Lawn this afternoon at 3:53 p.m. to talk about XYZ, right? You can just say, instead, the White House, okay? In the civil rights struggles of the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of talk about the man and what the man was doing to different disadvantaged social groups at that time. That's a big proxy for what we would call today patriarchy and embedded misogyny and racism, all that stuff. But it's a lot easier and quicker and more compact to say the man. And that also puts like an individual face on it. I can't hold in my head an entire society and all of its problems, but I could picture one just horrible douchebag of a guy, probably really old, probably politically powerful, just like holding people down. I can get that at a guttural level, right? Cool, or a gut level, excuse me. So that's metonymy. You're using something that is not attached to what it represents, but is associated with the White House for the press secretary. Okay? Synecdoche, on the other hand, is the more specific. You're using a part of the whole to identify or ask about the whole. Okay, so that is using a contained part. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear. When Shakespeare wrote that line, he was not asking for people to cut off and transfer their ear cartilage to the asker or the speaker of his line. He was asking for their auditory attention. Right? So if you are an education history double major and you're working with younger kids in your student teaching, you might say at some point to gather people's attention, hey everybody, stop me for this one. Eyes on me. Okay? You don't actually want them to place their eyeball in some physically touching way. That's not where you pink eye. But we all understand, okay, if I have your eyes, what I'm really talking about is your attention, focus. You are parsing what I am doing and visually excluding other distracting things. Okay? So, metonymy, part to whole, but not a part of, just associated with. Synecdoche is part to whole, and the part is some subset of the whole. Ear for human attention. Sound good? Okay. We want to take a look at a whole bunch of additionals. So let's run through these. Oh. No, let's skip these. Let's talk about humor instead. We'll go back to those. I don't want to leave you on, like, talking about active versus passive verbs. That's gonna, I was gonna say put you to sleep, but that's a metaphor. Okay, moving on. So, humor, we have theories about humor. We have top people working on it. Humor, we can call benign violation. This is so cool. It's not actually low temperature, that's a metaphor. All right. So, there are two parts to everything that make it funny. The first is that it's a violation of something about the topic. Typically, some commonly held expectation or belief or faith or sense of the topic. And we're violating that thing, saying, that's not true, this other thing is true. Okay. Punchline of a joke is usually violating whatever premise or series of assumptions we've led the audience along for that topic. Okay? So set up, twist it, flip it on its head. That's the punchline. Okay? And the other part that makes something funny instead of horribly offensive and vile is that it's safe. It's safe for the audience member. Okay. Show of hands, how many of you guys and gals have heard of the statement, comedy is someone else's tragedy? Yeah, that's what the benign part is referring to, okay? So when a stand-up comedian is working the room and they're making fun of politicians, which is a pretty easy sort of punching bag metaphor for stand-up comedians. They've been making jokes about politicians for millennia. Well, typically there's not a lot of politicians in the room. So it's safe, it's okay, because we're not talking about you, the audience member. We're talking about somebody else who's not even here and will never know about this conversation. So that's the benign part. Makes sense? So, in interpretation, the way that we use humor is as the following. We never, ever make your topic, especially if it's people, never make them the butt of the joke. Ever. And you never, ever, ever, ever make your participants, your interviewees, the butt of the joke. And you stay away from the possibility of the joke landing hard on somebody. If you've ever been sort of verbally torn down by somebody in a public setting, you know how awful that feels. Okay? And it's even more awful for those of anybody in the room that have so-called rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Like, you can genuinely, physiologically ruin someone's day by even accidentally including them in humor as sort of the target of the joke. Maybe you don't know that they belong to that group that you're joking about, but they do. And their day is pretty much over at that point. Okay? So we never do that. This is a professional thing. We're trying to connect with folks, not shove somebody to the side. Or literally. So that leaves pretty much one target for humor, in interpretation at least. You. If you're making self-deprecating humor, that is intentionally lowering your standing a little bit, taking yourself down a peg, figuratively speaking, that's safe. Because the people recognize, your participants recognize, you could be joking about them. And you are choosing not to do that. It's also lowering any perceived authority or power imbalance or differential between you and your participants, such that, oh gosh, this guy's got a pretty healthy sense of humor about himself. He just, opened up this interp. He caught everybody's attention. The hook was a joke about himself. So this is going to be a pretty humble, low-key, relatable interpreter. I think this next hour is going to be pretty interesting. I'm already a little bit more relaxed because if so-and-so is, poking fun at themselves and doing it clearly in a way that is not particularly serious. It's not like I have daddy issues and I'm not okay. Ha ha ha. Let's start our interp, right? That's a little bit too on the nose. But if you're being kind of ironic about it, like, yeah, this is a goofy side of me, but I'll let you into that. That's a very warm way to start things out, okay? So, with humor, with metaphor, with synecdoche and metonymy maybe, if you're lucky. For Monday's class, see if you can find your favorite song, or two or three, print out the lyrics, and look for any of these content techniques, just the ones that we found so far. See if you can find any of them in those lyrics. But if you're looking, it's not a whole bunch of literal facts recited one after the other. Facts are hard to rhyme as well. If you have a bunch of metaphor in there, for example, you can express things a whole bunch of different ways and still get the same message across in a way that rhymes, for example. Okay? So, whatever song you want, as long as it's not super just over-the-top offensive, but that's rarely an issue, right? Print off a couple of songs worth of lyrics and see if you can find anything in there along the lines of what we've done so far. So, you might be able to find plenty of labeling and self-referencing in country songs, especially in super old school like the country, not so much the pop country these days. There's some of that there, but yeah, okay. See if you can find any of those. And we'll have fun on Monday singing your favorite songs, finding some figurative language techniques. Sound good? All right, that's it for today. We'll end about 30 seconds early. Have a good weekend. Hopefully it warms up a little bit. But at least it's not raining. It could be worse. It's better than a sharp stick in the eye, as we say in forestry. Which is technically a literal statement. Yeah, that one's not figurative. All right. Cool. See you later.
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the game design, I think I submitted the wrong thing. Out there being so I like.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, this is the game design brief that we were working on today.
Yeah.
But
That was
you
like-
haven't wasted that effort. Hang on to that. We're going right there now, right? So that's cool.
Is it possible that I pretty much are same questions, but I just still submit this today, because I think my D2L is looking fun because all the dates are kind of messed up on here.
Oh yeah, no, that's everybody.
That's
not
everybody?
just-
Okay,
yeah.
so I'm like, not So this is what it looks like. Okay. And then also, a few classes ago, we had to like come up with the 3 points, or like 3 keys. So I'm right, so I'm supposed to be not just right. Is what I'm realizing. Yeah, okay. So.
But as you can see, you're not going to get penalized for timing on this. Like this list of drop boxes only became visible to you guys this past week, right? So you're not crazy, you're not behind. It's all good.
Okay, good. So I just have to like take pictures of this and put that.
It's fine. Real quick.
Okay. All right. I'm just making sure.
Yeah, you've done the work.
I just did
You're good.
I did the wrong thing today, but I was like, oh shoot. But,
No, you're good.